Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery. My wormery consists of that shelf back there. It's got a bunch of trays on it with worms in it. They're all composting my compostable materials, paper bits and leaves and kitchen scraps, coffee, you name it. And the bins that I've got on the agenda for today are my African nightcrawlers. I've got African nightcrawlers in 2 bins, but it's not one for one. I've got one bin that's got the adult worms in it, and then I got another bin where I'm trying to see if I can give some time for the material in which I believe there to be African nightcrawler cocoons to hatch and give the babies time to grow and then try to lure them out of the material over time. And these systems are the ones that you see on the shelf down there. It's in the lower corner of the screen, the 2 over there on the right. And they've been going that way, the way they're set up now, for 66 days. I got a few little bits of info about them written down here that I thought I'd cover really quick before we get started. So like I said, they're 66 days, and one of them has the adult worms in it, and those have been in the composting mode for all 66 days, over which time they've received 7 feedings, and one of those 7 feedings actually includes the food that was used to build the bin. So after the worms got launched into that bin that already had feeding number 1 in it, they've been fed 6 times over those 11 days, over those 66 days, which I guess in a way gives me an average of checking in on them about every 11 days. It's been 9 days since the last time we checked in on these 2 systems. As far as the cocoon nursery, as I refer to it, that sat that way for 30 days, where it was just the cocoons and the castings that the cocoons were in, sitting for 30 days, at which point I initiated an attempt to try to lure the worms out of the material, which I refer to as horizontal migrating, because I set up the feeding zone, the collection zone on one edge of the bin, and that started 36 days ago. And over that time, I've reinforced the food in that collection zone 4 times now. So after 9 days, I'm just curious to see how we're coming along. Is the cocoon nursery reaching the point where maybe all the cocoons have hatched, all the babies have come together? If the castings appear to be worm-free at this point, and maybe free of unhatched cocoons, then maybe we're done there. So we'll assess that today. And then after 9 days, I believe that the feeding of the worms is a due activity as well. 9 days, I believe it's plenty of time. All they got last time was just stuff like the tops of strawberries, some cucumber shavings, a little bit of coffee. It wasn't even that much, so I'm sure that they've probably done away with that by now. So I'm going to get these systems out onto the bench, and we're going to get to work. We're starting down here in the nursery bin, and the reason I like to start here is because I'm never certain about, where we're at with this type of a system. If we are in fact done, then there's no need to bring food for them down here. But if it does seem like more time is going to be required, then come on, wake up, buddy. Then I do come down with food with which to reset the baiting area. And that's, dependent on what's going on in there. Besides trying to lure worms out of the material over to this edge, I did one other thing last week, which was to also try to see if maybe I can create a little baiting area right over here in the middle. So I rested, trying to remember what it was. I'm pretty sure it was banana peel. So I believe that's what we're seeing right here is some banana peel. And I think there was also something else placed right beneath the banana peel to see if, maybe some baby worms, rather than needing to haul it all the way over to the collection area, maybe they would sense some goodies right over here and come over for them. So I'm just going to take what was set over there for them and set that aside. I'm also going to take these top covering pieces of paper and set them aside so we have some room to work here. I could see a cocoon right here, very dark in color, suggesting to me that it's ripe to hatch, but might not have hatched yet. Here's one that appears to be even darker in color. I'm not sure how well the camera's picking them up, because they are pretty tiny little objects and they are pretty dark in color against this dark material. It might be tough to see them, but they are pretty easy to spot once you start actually looking for them. There's another one. I just put it right there next to the other 2. And you know, times like this, I wonder if it's just best to assume that those are still going to hatch, and if they are, then we might as well put them over where we want the babies to end up eventually. So I'm going to inspect this material that was right beneath the banana peel, you know, and whatever the other thing was that was placed under the banana peel. It doesn't seem like it's really created much of a turnout. It did seem like we spotted one baby worm there, maybe one or two, but certainly not the type of turnout that I was sort of halfway expecting. I really did, in a way, think that it was going to attract some worms over to it, but I don't really see any action. You know, that alone, I think, also makes me start to question whether or not any more time is needed, because, you know, a couple tasty morsels placed smack in the middle of the bin, you would think that it would attract more than just one or two worms. But it didn't. So maybe there's no worms to be attracted left in this material. And I mean, after 66 days, you know, I know that it takes a certain amount of time for some cocoons that might have had just been placed into the material by the worms. Give that stuff some time to hatch. And then for those little baby worms to sort of get big enough and mobile enough to make their way around the bin, start scouring the contents of the bin looking for nourishment, and hopefully eventually end up over where we want them. But I think what we had done in the past was we did just sort of start inspecting the material and looking around, and then in the past we had typically bumped into one or two worms along the way, which did tell us that there probably was some extra time required to let this continue on. But I'm starting to get this feeling that we might actually be near the end, if not at the end already. I think I did already sense recently that we were definitely nearing the end, because even though we did bump into a worm or two out here, we didn't see much. In a lot of my nursery bins, I do try to allow this material out here to really dry considerably to make it stuff that the worms probably don't want to remain in, to sort of motivate them to go looking for more damp and hospitable material to be in. But here I did keep it covered with plastic to try to maintain that nice damp, moist consistency and not let it dry. Nevertheless, it's still so nice and fine and crumbly. It's really nice stuff. So like here, I've you know, I figured if I do spot any more cocoons that look like they've not yet hatched, I might as well snag them and move them over. Although this one kind of has like a distorted sort of look to it. Maybe it is already a hatched cocoon, but it's a little bit difficult to tell. I am kind of starting to get that feeling like there's probably not a whole lot left to happen in here. And after 66 days, that seems like a realistic outcome. I don't know exactly how long it would take for a cocoon to hatch. I mean, sometimes you hear people using certain figures like 3 to 4 weeks or 21 to 24 days. But then again, I'm not even sure if those might be figures that you hear for red wiggler worms. These aren't red wiggler worms. These are supposedly African nightcrawlers. But if the nightcrawler cocoon takes anywhere around that same amount of time, then we've definitely given it that much time and then some. So I'm not really suspecting that much more time is really needed. The only other thing that I guess is going to potentially prolong the process and the time required for cocoons to hatch is the situation or the conditions not being entirely optimal for that to occur. And I don't know if that could be dampness, it could be temperature, but I would think that, you know, now that we're kind of in the summer months, actually I believe today is the first day of summer, right? June 21st. Today is the 21st of June. I think we're now in those types of temperature ranges here where or even a more tropical type of worm such as the African nightcrawler its cocoons would probably easily hatch in this type of condition. And I'm down here in my basement where it's a little cooler than usual, but there's no climate control down here. No air conditioning or anything like that, so it does get warm down here when the temperature outside is warm, even though it does stay a little bit cooler than upstairs if there's nothing going on as far as cooling. But I am starting to get that sense that perhaps the time has come to not think about how to continue prompting the worms to migrate out of the finished castings, but rather consider this as a batch of finished castings that's pretty much free of any worms at this point, and treat it as castings that can at this point just be harvested. And that means we could just take the collection zone out of this bin and relocate the worms that have gathered over here and get them over into the other bin where the rest of their family is. So here I did locate one little baby tiny worm, but I'm now kind of right on the edge of this material here, and that's why I'm thinking this is the material that I'm kind of willing to pick through a little bit more thoroughly to see if I can still include those few worms that are inhabiting this borderline material with what's going to get extracted and relocated into another active bin. But you know, if a couple remain within my castings and get used out in the garden, that's really fine too. I really have no objection to that. But I'm just trying to create something of a division line here of what I would want to consider to be finished castings and what it is that I'm going to be scooping out of here to relocate over into the other bin that we're going to work on next. And I'm thinking, what's the right sequence of events? I suppose it would make the best sense just to take care of applying the food that was going to go into that bin first, get that activity settled, and then proceed to the release of whatever worms that we managed to gather here. So I think I've got a pretty good separation at this point of castings and or worms that have been collected to be relocated. And you know, when worms are being relocated in a huge pile of material like this here, it's not going to be very easy to get a sense of how many we managed to collect. I usually like to try to get a sense of how many worms I'm populating a system with, or how many worms I'm adding to an existing system. But in this case, I don't think we're going to have that opportunity to really get a good visual sense of how many worms we've collected here. So I need a pretty good size something to put all this into. Let me get a box and we'll continue. Now this is one of my boxes that I use for this sort of stuff. It's a pretty decent sized container. Hopefully it's big enough to hold everything that's over here. So why don't we just start pulling stuff out. Alright, there is a lot of bedding in here. I did do sort of a bedding reset in here. I think it was just 9 days ago when we were last in here. It seemed to me like this process could continue a little while longer, and I wasn't even sure of how many worms I had managed to collect over here. So I did want to make sure I was providing them with a nice, adequately sized space to be in. One that they'd be comfortable in, and that they could find plenty of food in. So I guess the other benefit that this transfer is going to give the other bin is that it's going to give the other bin another significant boost in bedding, which it already received last week. I definitely gave that other system a nice significant boost of bedding last time when I was in here to feed it. And this time it's going to get even more, because there is quite a bit in here. So let's see if I can fish out any last little worms that might still be visible here. I mean, this stuff is already also kind of littered with a bunch of debris here, so rather than counting it as finished castings, I might as well just haul it over into the other active system where everything else is going, so that it's got an opportunity to further break down over there. So we'll just put this in here too. Not even sure if there's any worms in here. There might be one or two. I can see the little baby one over there. That's the thing, the little baby ones are certainly difficult to spot. They are really tiny. So I guess we just had the perfect size box here for this. So I'm just on the brim, but luckily not overflowing. And as far as this is concerned, I guess this brings an end to this process. 66 days. It might not have required quite as much time, but I mean, up until as recently as last time we were in here, which was 9 days ago, I was fairly sure that I was still observing baby worms cruising around out there within the castings material. And that was part of what had made me decide it was going to continue. And I guess, I don't know, I just feel compelled to just glance through here quickly just to see how all the material looks, see if I can possibly spot another baby worm or two. But like I said, if this stuff goes right out into the garden now, it's only benefiting my garden if it's got worms in it, so I shouldn't worry too much about it. But look at this stuff, it's certainly nice. I thought I just saw a worm over here. I did. Or is it a stick? I think it was just a stick. It's like a worm mirage. It's just a figment of my imagination. So yeah, there's little bits of stuff in here that could easily be mistaken as a worm. And I guess I'm just sort of hoping that I might be able to snag one or two more. But in the grand scheme of things, a few worms, a few cocoons that have yet to hatch. It's all good, valuable material to be included when it comes time to use this stuff out in the garden. So look at this stuff. It's so nice and fine. It pretty much has the perfect consistency. It all just crumbles. And if I was really going for like some sort of degree of perfection, like where I wouldn't want a piece of material like this, an avocado shell fragment within the material, I could run all this through a screen one more time, but why? You know, I mean, it certainly makes no difference to me. This is pretty much perfect as far as I'm concerned. So I'm going to get this out of the way, and I think we can move on to feeding the adult bin. So let's do that next. All right, so here in the adult bin, I think we had been covering this bin up with plastic up until the last time we checked in here. So these paper and cardboard coverings were just a recent addition. And it's mainly because the humidity in the air is increasing now that summer's rolling in and whatnot. So I've just been wanting to try to boost airflow in my systems. Now before I continue, I'm just getting this plastic covering here that had been covering the castings. And I wanted to see if I could sort of scrape it off and clean it off, because I do see baby worms caught up in the castings here. They're almost invisible. They're so tiny. But I'm going to see if I can scrape this stuff off here and try to release those baby worms down into here, which is really where they belong. I would hate to think that they're going to remain stuck out here on this plastic, left to dry and to die. And usually it doesn't matter if it's just the castings that are drying, and then I could scrape them off later and return them to some bin. But when it's the baby worms, or you know, any worms stuck on the plastic with the castings, those are the ones I worry about, and I just don't want to leave them stranded. Alright, I think we got the majority of them. I will set this aside and take a closer look before I consider this as a completely clean piece of plastic, just to make sure we haven't, like I said, leave any worms out here to be stranded and dry. So here, the feeding that I applied went along with a whole bunch of extra bedding last time. And the feeding was applied down the middle. And it was material that I didn't really expect to see stick around too long. This looks like a banana stem, which is definitely coming along nicely. I guess as we start peeling some of this top cover aside, we could already see some worms just hanging out here near the surface. I think the way I did it was I put in a layer of bedding, dropped in some food, and then I put in even more bedding, dropped in a second layer of food. So the food was in here, mixed in with a good amount of fresh bedding too, which should have really made it into a space that the worms would really be excited to hang out in. So I'm going to just do kind of a disruptive tilling up of the material here. There's a lot of castings floating around here mixed in with all this stuff. And while I could certainly see chunks of paper and cardboard in here, I'm really not expecting to see any leftover remains of those strawberry tops that were used to feed this bin last time. I mean, there were other little bits and pieces of stuff. So like here, for example, I don't know if this was part of the last feeding. This probably goes back further. This is just the sort of the stem end of some sort of a, I don't even know, some sort of a veggie. And it's getting broken down quite nicely. And it'll be gone soon. But certain things, I guess, just take a little bit longer than others. But things look really nice down here. I think we had created almost like a perfect space for these little guys with all the bedding we added last time and a bunch of foods that should be pretty easy for them to break down pretty quickly. So that's pretty cool. Okay. So I've created a nice little opening here, but I don't have the food that we're going to use to feed with yet. I figured I would wait until we got a chance to assess the nursery bin first, and then I would come down here with a portion that was suitable for whatever was determined based on the needs of both this bin and that bin together. But at this point, I think all we're really dealing with is, you know, a good feeding to give this system here, to tie it over for another week or two. So I'm going to take another break here just for a moment or two, head upstairs to the freezer, grab grab some stuff to bring down here for them, and then we'll proceed with the feeding. Well, I don't know. I could have gone a little bit overboard, because usually I try to size my feedings in somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2 handfuls, but this looks to me almost like double that. So you also have to take into account that I've got a second coffee filter here that's also got the coffee in it still. So this is a significant amount of food, that's for certain. So I'm thinking perhaps a good way to add it is in a way similar to how I did last time, which is to rest perhaps about half of it on a nice generous layer of bedding materials. And I mean, right off the bat, I've already got it in my hand. A couple soiled paper towels will serve nicely as sort of a foundational bedding for this feeding. But another thing that I pulled out of the other bin was this paper covering that was covering the castings before. So while I think I'll just return the plastic covering onto those castings to not permit them to dry out any further while they're on standby sitting around waiting to be used out in the garden, I don't need this paper covering anymore, and it's pretty far gone anyway, so it's very deteriorated. I don't think it's got much other purpose than to be used as additional bedding in my worm bins. So here's more bedding. Besides the coffee, there's the coffee filter, which will go in here as even more bedding for the wormies. So you'll remember too, what came out of the other bin with the baby worms that we extracted was also a tremendous amount of bedding. So this once again is just a massive boost to the bedding in this system, significantly increasing the volume within this bin. So let's see. I think I'm going to get some grit in here too. So I'd like to make sure I'm applying a nice generous portion of grit with my feedings as well. So the grit that I'm using here is pulverized eggshell. Some people use sand. Some people use pulverized crustacean shells, stuff like that. It's whatever you've got on hand, which is, you know, minute particle size, hard material. Some people I think use rock dust maybe. So there's a whole range of different things one could use as grit in their worm bins. So kind of like the last feeding, more strawberry tops. It's usually an item that is compliments of my mom. Almost every time I go over there for like a family meal or something, there's almost always strawberries this time of year. So these are all the bits of the strawberry that we humans don't particularly consider appealing, the leaves. But the worms are probably going to really enjoy it. So now, before we add the remainder of the food, I'm going to put in a little bit more bedding, but you know, I'm almost thinking this might be the time to add this, since it is so rich in bedding. Let's save that for the end. I've got some shredded newspaper we could lay down in here. Lots and lots of bedding this go around, sort of like the last go around. There was lots and lots of bedding added. So these worms should be pretty happy with what they're getting. As much as they're going to enjoy all of this nitrogen-rich type food that they're receiving, all of these kitchen scraps, these food bits, which are generally known in the worm composting vocabulary to be sort of the nitrogen-rich food that they're getting. The nightcrawlers, which I was led to believe that these are nightcrawlers, although I'm not even 100% sure. The nightcrawlers are definitely a type of worm that really likes the carbon-rich types of foods, which is usually the materials that you're using as their bedding. So it doesn't only serve as their bedding, but it eventually ends up becoming one of their favorite foods as well. So I think that covers it. I think I've given them all of the food that I came down here with for them. And the only thing remaining at this point, I believe, is to release the ones that we collected. And we got quite a bit of stuff in here. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to really see many worms because they're probably all very tiny worms and they're probably all intermixed within the material that they're inhabiting. So as nice as it would be to get a sense of how many worms we've managed to collect in this process and relocate, we're just going to have to, I guess, take whatever we can get. You know, if here and there we can manage to spot perhaps a somewhat larger worm that maybe had just fallen through the screening process and went into that bin as part of the finished compost. Here we see a number of little baby worms mixed in. Here's a somewhat larger worm with a little baby worm next to it. So there's worms here and there scattered throughout this material, but certainly no easy way for us to size up how many we just collected and relocated. I mean, here we could see perhaps a little jumble of a few little baby worms as well as a somewhat larger worm hanging out on this piece of newspaper. So up until now, I've been operating on the assumption that this bin is populated with something in the neighborhood of about 1,500 worms based on the number of worms that I had originally launched it with 66 days ago. But at this point, it's just going to have to be a real estimate at this point. I don't even know if I can treat it as a observation. But I would like to think that we've managed to collect at least 500 worms in here, in the form of babies, in the form of little worms that might have just slipped through the screening process and ended up in that batch of finished compost and were collected into the baiting area later. So from this point forward, I'm going to be treating this as a 2,000 occupant African nightcrawler worm bin. So like even down here in these corners where the material's a little bit drier, I still see lots of worms hanging out. So while in the recent months I've always been thinking that more moisture was more favorable for the worms, lately I've been really striving towards running somewhat drier bins to try to also increase airflow within the material and not let things get muddy and anaerobic. And it does seem like even the drier material, stuff that I would have probably considered way too dry just a few months ago, is still probably quite suitable for these worms, and they're more than happy to hang out in it. And man, oh man, has the size of this bin increased a lot lately. Between a whole lot of bedding getting added last time we were in here 9 days ago, as well as all the stuff that came along with the babies on this run, as well as that huge quantity of food that we just placed in here for them, this bin is finally starting to look like a nice respectable worm bin and a good volume of material for a 2,000 strong population. So I think this bin is going to really start to take off at this point. With this many worms, given this much space, hopefully they're going to start breeding, mating, and creating a whole bunch of additional baby worms for us as well. All right, I'm coming back in here with this coffee filter that had basically attempted to show us where we had applied the last feeding 9 days ago. So it's coming back in to start serving that same purpose. And the rest is all just top coverings. So that's where we stand now. I guess this is feeding number 8 for my 66-day-old African nightcrawler system, bringing an end to the cocoon nursery after 66 days as well. And now we've got ourselves a bin with an estimated 2,000 worms in it. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts as far as, you know, do you tend to agree with those sort of numbers? Do you agree with the way this system is being managed? I hope so. It's definitely in line with what a lot of people have been suggesting is the way to go. Even though I was kind of doing my own thing there for a while, I believe that this is definitely more consistent with what's commonly agreed to in the worm community as the best way to handle a nice nightcrawler system. Give them lots of bedding, give them lots of carbon, and don't run it too wet. Don't let things get anaerobic. All right, everyone, that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Bye now.